Hello there, welcome back to the channel. And I started a bit of a theme with my previous video, which I'm a bit of a completionist, so I think it's time to do it. Exploring the fleets of the Klingons and the Romulans, and we're starting with the Romulans specifically. As you may have noted from clicking on this video's title, we are talking about the Romulan Bird of Prey, specifically the 23rd century incarnation, possibly the most famous and enduring of this classification of vessel as utilized by the Romulan Star Empire. Bit of backstory: of course the Romulans did have predecessors to this class, but this vessel would be a revolution in design for the Star Empire. It was the pioneer of a new type of cloaking device, a small but effective little ship. Before we get started, in the description of this vessel, please like, share, subscribe and comment down below. Tell me what you think about it and which vessel you want reviewing next. I'll try and get through them all, but I might not do every ship, so maybe you'll mention one that I'm not going to do, and I'll try and include it. So, the Romulan Bird of Prey, again specifically the 23rd century incarnation. The 22nd century version needs its own dedicated video, I feel. This ship was first encountered in 2266, although it was a prototype at this point. We don't know exactly when it was launched. We can assume it had been in service for at least a little while, undergoing a shakedown cruise before the Romulans were confident enough to deploy this vessel against Federation targets. One interesting thing to note about this vessel, which we want to discuss in the comments because I've got my theories on it, but I want to know everyone else's. This ship did not have a warp propulsion system. It was impulse powered only. Now we know that impulse, of course, is sublight. So how exactly did this vessel really get around? My theory is it was either towed by another vessel, which would make sense, or it had some kind of warp sled. Now this is precedented in Star Trek, particularly in Vulcan culture, when we see the so-called warp sled and shuttle utilized by Spock upon boarding the Enterprise at one point. And this craft was basically similar to a sort of hyperspace ring from Star Trek. It was from Star Wars, rather. I'm so sorry for that mistake. It was basically an attachment that attached to a shuttle that was otherwise sublight, which allowed the vessel to then be propelled at warp velocity. My guess would be the Bird of Prey has some apparatus not unlike this, but it's never depicted and nothing ever said of it, but it would make sense. But let me know in the comments below your theories on how exactly the ship got around. Going back to the vessel itself, it earned its name not just from its general hull profile, which was vaguely reminiscent of a bird, but also because the Romulans literally painted a bird onto the hull of this ship. The reason for that is unknown, but the Romulans themselves are a society that do seem to very much like iconography and symbolism. And the eagle is very prevalent in Romulan culture, being the very symbol of both the Romulan Empire itself and a variant of that symbol being used by the shadowy organization known as the Tal Shiar. Now, the Bird of Prey, of course, had this big bird of prey painted on the underside of it. What bird exactly this is unknown. It's clearly not going to be a bald eagle or something from Earth, so it's some kind of similarly evolved avian predator that exists on Romulus or possibly on Vulcan. The Bird of Prey itself was a small ship which had, going out of canon for a second, reminiscent designs similar to those of the Federation, and this was because the original script stated that this craft was actually a Romulan ship built based on Federation designs. In other words, it was a Romulan adaptation of a Federation ship. As I said, the vessel would be encountered in 2266. It would be used for an incursion across the Romulan neutral zone into Federation space to test both its new technologies and perhaps the defensive capabilities and will of the Federation and Starfleet. It would attack and utterly destroy several Federation outposts, leaving no survivors. That was until the USS Enterprise, NCC 1701, under the command of Captain James Tiberius Kirk, entered the area and started to track the vessel down. Now, being a cloaked ship, the Enterprise of course struggled with this, but was able eventually to intercept transmissions, home in on the vessel, and slowly creep up on it. One of the deficiencies of the Bird of Prey is when it was cloaked, its sensors were also blinded and had very limited visibility. It couldn't be seen itself, but the problem was no one else could see it either. We did for the first time in Federation history, however, learn that Romulans were biological cousins of the Vulcans via contact with this and communication intercepts between the Bird of Prey and the Romulan Empire. This was, of course, a revelation to the Federation and quite shocking to Spock and many of the crew, particularly the human crew of the Enterprise, who had in previous generations suffered horrendous losses during the Earth-Romulan War. The vessel itself, getting back to it, was, as I said, a small impulse ship only, with an advanced prototype cloaking device, which is what its real strength was. Armaments consisted primarily of plasma torpedoes, and although it's not demonstrated, quite likely it did have at least a limited disruptor array. This vessel would remain in service and would primarily be used by the Romulans as a border patrol ship, at one point intercepting a vessel with a full squadron of these ships, 10 of them in total intercepting a single Federation starship. The usual battle tactic was they would travel cloaked, decloak, attack the vessel with its plasma torpedoes, disable its shields, withdraw, and allow larger Romulan battlecruisers to finish off the ship, as the Bird of Prey was no match for a Federation starship in a straight fight on its own, unless it had superior numbers or maybe a good bit of surprise on its side. Starfleet would categorize this vessel as a Bird of Prey, but exactly again what the Romulans called it, as in its class name, is unknown, and interestingly none of these vessels were ever named on screen. They would, however, endure for over 100 years, with these vessels still being in service, at least in some limited capacity, by the Romulans as late as 2399, when one of them was used to attack the La Sirena. This version, of course, had multiple upgrades, likely a warp drive and more advanced, more modernized disruptor systems and sensors, and probably upgrades to its cloaking device, I think we can safely assume. The interior of the ship was somewhat oppressive, very limited windows with a very harsh color scheme, making the vessel, from a human perspective, very claustrophobic, but perhaps from a Romulan one, perfectly fine and acceptable. It had a stark, brutalistic architectural style within the hull, and was very segregated with thick, strong bulkheads, and I said the paint scheme interior was much richer than that of a Federation ship, a kind of garish colour scheme that humans would generally find quite oppressive, rich reds and other strong colours. The bridge itself, which is the main area of the ship we are aware of, was built more like a cockpit. It was small, extremely functional, and could only house a handful of officers around a small number of consoles located primarily in the centre of the room. The Romulans on board the ship wore elaborate uniforms as well as limited armour in the form of a helmet, and were usually armed at all times. The Romulan commander himself demonstrated a care for his crew and for his mission against the Federation, noting the Romulan similarity to humans in their sense of honour and how they engage the universe around them, how they see themselves versus it, but that's a discussion for another time. I did cover it a little bit in one of my last videos. One other minor thing to note, the Bird of Prey was also equipped with nuclear ordnance, but it should be pointed out that these were not for weapons, these were for self-destruct purposes, although we can imagine you could have easily removed one and utilised it in an offensive manner. The Romulans were never shown to do so. These devices were merely aboard the ship in order to facilitate the destruction of the starship, not as weapons for, say, planetary bombardment. And there we have the Romulan Bird of Prey, the first ship in this breakdown list. I'm going to get to the others in the next few days. With that said, tell me what you think about the Romulan Bird of Prey and the episode Balance of Terror, of course, the legendary episode Balance of Terror from the original series, which is perhaps iconically and very deservedly so one of the greatest episodes of Star Trek ever made. A game of cat and mouse, Second World War era, submarine warfare style. We all know the backstories, but it is a glorious episode, and if you've not seen it because you don't like the original series, or you think perhaps it's a little dated, I highly recommend this episode and Space Seed and a few others, but generally watch it. You won't be disappointed. The episode is phenomenal.
I just want to take this moment to thank you for watching that video. If you liked what you saw, please check out my social links in the description box below to Instagram and Twitter and others, and also is down there a link to my Patreon page where you can support this channel and the others as I try to grow this franchise and do this more regularly. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, thank you for watching, and bye bye.